One freezing dawn in the wild frontier, a poor rancher's simple act of kindness turned into a standoff that could end in bloodshed. On April 14, 1878, in the lonely San Pedro Valley of the Arizona Territory, a poor rancher struggled to keep his small farm alive against hunger, drought, and the endless dangers of the Wild West. But that night fate placed him on the edge of life and death when he heard cries rising from the river and found two native children fighting against the rushing water, their small hands slipping beneath the waves as the current dragged them down. And without thinking of his own safety, he leapt in, his body breaking through the freezing current, his lungs burning, his heart pounding, until with every ounce of strength he pulled the children out onto the muddy bank, shaking, gasping, yet alive, and as darkness fell across the desert sky he carried them back to his cabin, not knowing that by dawn he would face their father and 100 armed warriors. The night grew colder inside the small wooden cabin as the rescued children slept, wrapped in rough wool blankets near the dim fire, and the rancher sat silently on a broken chair, staring at the flickering flames while his mind wandered through the harshness of his life. For his cattle were thin and sick, their ribs showing through patchy hides, and the land offered little grass to feed them. Yet each dawn he rose to mend fences, haul water, and fight storms that bent the walls of his fragile home, a shack of creaking boards that barely stood against the desert winds. But though loneliness weighed heavy on his shoulders, he carried on with stubborn grit, never letting despair crush the faint hope that someday his work would matter. And perhaps because he had no wife or children of his own, his heart carried a quiet hunger for family. So when he heard the soft breaths of the little ones resting safe by his fire, something deep within him stirred, a tenderness he had not felt in years, mixed with dread of what dawn might bring, for he knew their tribe would come searching. And though he had given everything to save them, the wild frontier rarely rewarded kindness without cost. Yet still he watched the fire burn low, his calloused hands trembling as he whispered to himself that even if the rising sun brought death, at least tonight he had done what was right. As the last light of day stretched across the valley and shadows fell long over the dry earth, the rancher left his cabin to check on the cattle grazing near the San Pedro River, their weakened bodies moving slow, ribs sharp against skin, when suddenly a sound tore through the stillness. Not the cry of an animal, but the high-pitched screams of children carried by the wind, and his heart jolted as his eyes darted toward the Chimfa toward the Patinga rushing current where two small figures thrashed against the pull of the water, their arms flailing, their faces barely rising above the surface before sinking again. And in that instant he felt no hesitation, no thought of danger, only the fierce drive to act. Boots thrown off as he ran headlong into the river, the icy shock cutting through his chest, the current hammering his body, dragging him down, filling his lungs with burning cold. But he forced his way forward, reaching one child, gripping an arm that slipped like wet stone, dragging the small body close against him, then lunging for the other as the water spun them deeper, his muscles screaming, his vision fading. Yet with sheer will he fought, legs kicking against the torrent until finally he broke through toward the bank, every gasp like fire, the weight of two fragile lives pressed against him. And when at last he fell upon the muddy shore, chest heaving, body shaking, he pulled them both into the crook of his arms, their coughing voices rising with desperate gulps of air, alive, trembling, drenched, yet safe. And as the fading sun bled across the horizon, he lay there shivering with them, whispering words they could not understand but filled with the promise that he would not let go, even as the desert wind bit his skin and darkness gathered around. For he knew the night had only begun and the true test of his choice still waited with the coming dawn. Dragging his weary body up from the riverbank with the children clinging to his arms, the rancher pushed through the darkening valley until the faint outline of his cabin came into sight, the wooden walls groaning in the night wind. And once inside, he laid the little ones by the hearth where he sparked a fire to life, feeding it with what little wood he had left. the flames rising warm against the cold air as he stripped off their drenched clothes and wrapped them in rough blankets, watching the color return slowly to their cheeks, then slicing the last of his bread and pouring thin broth into tin cups so their trembling hands could hold something warm, their silent eyes filled with fear and confusion, yet softened with the comfort of heat and food. But while they ate in fragile peace, a heavy weight pressed against his chest, for he knew they were not orphans wandering by chance. They belonged to one of the most feared Apache bands in the territory, warriors who guarded their children with the fierceness of wolves, and if word reached their camp, his small act of mercy might be twisted into suspicion or worse, an unforgivable trespass. And though he leaned back against the wooden chair staring at the children dozing near the fire, his mind raced with visions of riders cresting the ridge, rifles flashing, arrows striking through the dark, the cabin splintering beneath their rage. Yet when he tried to close his eyes, sleep refused him, every creak of the boards, every howl of coyotes outside pulling his gaze to the door, the iron latch seeming too thin to keep death away. And the hours dragged with a silence so deep it roared in his ears, broken only by the soft breathing of the rescued children, a reminder that he had stepped across a line from which there was no turning back. And as the fire dimmed to glowing embers, he sat motionless, shoulders tense, heart pounding with the knowledge that the desert did not forget, and by dawn the truth of his choice would ride straight to his doorstep. The gray light of dawn crept across the valley as the rancher rose from his chair, his eyes raw from a sleepless night, when a low rumble began to spread through the desert floor, faint at first like distant thunder, then growing heavier until the very earth seemed to tremble, and he stepped to the doorway just as the first shapes broke over the ridge, a storm of riders pouring down with dust swirling in their wake, spears glinting, rifles resting across saddles, faces painted with fire, and in the center rode the Apache chief, tall and unshaken, his hair braided with eagle feathers, his gaze sharp as flint, and within moments the cabin was encircled, 100 horses stamping the ground in unison, the air thick with the smell of sweat and dust. Yet the rancher did not reach for his rifle nor shut the door. Instead, he walked forward barefoot into the cold morning, his hands open at his sides, his chest bare of any weapon, for he knew no iron could shield him now, and silence fell except for the restless snorts of the horses, the circle of warriors watching with narrowed eyes, their bows half raised, their fingers tight on triggers, as the chief dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the dirt, each step heavy with judgment, his dark eyes locked on the lone figure before him. And the rancher stood as still as stone, the taste of fear bitter on his tongue, the thought flashing through his mind that one wrong move would end it all, yet he did not flinch, did not plead, only lifted his chin to meet the gaze of the man whose children now slept in safety behind him. The air so tense it seemed the valley itself was holding breath, and in that endless moment between life and death, the rancher braced himself for whatever would come. The chief's boots pressed into the dust as he came closer, his eyes narrowed, unreadable, burning with suspicion that cut deeper than any blade, and the rancher's chest tightened as the silence thickened, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in the still air, when suddenly the cabin door burst open and the children rushed out, their small voices breaking the tension as they clung to their father's legs, tugging at his clothing, pointing back toward the weary figure who had pulled them from the river, their words spilling fast, carrying the truth of what had happened. And though the rancher could not understand their language, the urgency in their tone struck him like a thunderclap. Yet the warriors around remained rigid, rifles raised, horses stamping the earth as if they too felt the edge of violence ready to break loose, and the chief stood frozen, his hand hovering near the knife at his belt, his face a mask of stone, the children tugging harder, their wide eyes pleading, their gestures fierce and desperate. And still no sound came from the circle except the shifting of hooves and the faint rattle of metal, each second stretching unbearably long, each breath a gamble between mercy and blood. And the rancher held his ground, unarmed, unshaken, though his pulse hammered and his throat was dry. his silence a statement of trust, his stillness a shield stronger than any gun. And as the pause deepened, the tension coiled tighter, the world shrinking to the space between the chief's stare and the truth spoken by two small voices, until the weight of decision hung heavy in the desert air, a single choice away from death or deliverance. The chief's hand pressed gently on the rancher's shoulder, and in that simple gesture the years of fear, suspicion, and the harsh desert life melted away. The warriors around lowering their rifles slowly, their eyes softening as if a heavy storm had passed, and the rancher felt a wave of relief so deep it shook him to the core. For he had faced death and the judgment of a tribe, yet stood alive, unhurt, honored in a way he had never imagined. The children laughing and hugging their father, safe and whole. The sun now spilling gold across the San Pedro Valley, painting every ridge and cactus in a warmth that mirrored the gratitude and trust that now bound two worlds together. And as he looked at the chief's steady gaze, he realized that courage and compassion could speak louder than fear or violence, that even in the wildest lands hearts could connect across divides. And as the dust settled, he whispered to himself that one act of kindness can change the course of many lives. So what would you do if you were in his place? Would you risk everything to save someone else? And remember to share, subscribe, and watch more stories on Western Stories, because sometimes the smallest choices leave the greatest marks.